I'm Ben McGorm. This is The Wild Harvest. I've been thinking about this a fair bit lately. Not just about hunting itself, but about the way I've been talking about it. Because across this season, I've covered a lot of ground. Not in terms of kilometres walked or animals seen, although there's been plenty of that, but in how I've tried to make sense of it all. What it is. What it asks of you. Where it sits in the world we live in now. And for the most part, I've been speaking from inside the experience. Trying to describe things as they actually feel. Not just how they look from the outside. Slowing it down. Pulling it apart. Sitting with it long enough to say something that's at least close to true. From where I'm standing. Not as someone who's done this for decades, and not as someone who's seen everything there is to see. Just as someone who came into it later than most. Struggled more than expected. Stayed with it. And has started to understand a few things that weren't as obvious at the start. And I think that matters. Because it keeps the perspective honest. It keeps it grounded in the reality of learning something properly. Instead of pretending it was always clear. But there's one thing I've been circling around. Without really stepping into. I've talked about hunting. I've talked about the culture. I've talked about responsibility. About restraint. About what sits right and what doesn't. What I haven't really done, not properly, is talk about myself inside all of that. Not in a way that holds up to the same standard. It's easy to describe the thing itself. It's easier to talk about the process. The decisions, the outcomes, even the mistakes, when they sit, at a bit of a distance. Harder to look at the assumptions you brought in. Harder to admit when you were misunderstanding something. Not because no one told you, but because you filled in the gaps yourself. And didn't question it at the time. And that's the part that's been sitting with me. Because learning something like this, it doesn't just add knowledge. It exposes the shape of what you didn't understand before. Sometimes that happens gradually, and you pick things up. You adjust. You refine the way you move through it. Other times it's sharper. A moment where something clicks. Not in a satisfying way, but in a way that makes you realise you've been carrying something slightly off for longer than you thought. And I think once you see that clearly, it's hard to go back to the version of yourself that didn't notice it. And that's the part that's been sitting with me more than I expected. Because once you say something out loud, especially something like this, it doesn't really stay yours. It becomes something other people hear, interpret, form opinions around. Some will agree with it. Some won't. And some will take parts of it and leave the rest. And that's fine. That's part of putting anything out into the world. But it also means I don't get to treat this like it's just me figuring things out in isolation anymore. There's a level of responsibility that comes with speaking about it publicly. Not in a big, formal sense. Just in the simple reality that what I say, and I guess how I say it, shapes how things might be understood by someone who's never experienced it for themselves. And that's not something I take lightly, because I know how easy it is to get the wrong impression. I've had plenty of those myself. So this isn't just about what I think anymore. It's about whether I'm actually living in line with what I've been saying. Whether the standard I've been describing is the one I'm holding when it matters. And that's a different question entirely. That's where this episode comes from. Not from a need to correct anything I've said earlier in the season, and not from a sense that I've suddenly arrived at some clearer, more authoritative position. If anything, it's the opposite of that. It's a recognition that the more time you spend in this, the more aware you become of how much sits underneath the surface of it. How much of it isn't visible until you've made a few mistakes. And how much of it only makes sense after the fact. And how easy it is, especially early on, to feel like you understand something when you're actually just close enough to it to describe it, but not close enough to see where you're getting it wrong. Now, that doesn't mean everything I've said across the season has been off. A lot of it still holds. The emphasis on restraint, the importance of process, the reality of what it feels like compared to how it's perceived. Those things haven't changed. But what has changed is how I see myself inside of it all. And when I actually started looking at that properly, a few things became pretty clear. When I think back to how I approached this earlier on, there's a few things that stand out pretty clearly now. Not in a way where I look back and think I had it completely wrong, more just I didn't understand what I was actually looking at. And I didn't realise that at the time. I think one of the biggest ones was how I saw hunting culture. Earlier on, I treated it like something you proved yourself into. Like there was a line you had to cross where once you'd done enough or learnt enough or been out enough times, you'd earned your place in it. And until then, you were sort of on the outside, trying to figure it out quietly. No one ever told me that directly, but it's how I carried myself. Head down, work it out, don't ask too much. Just keep showing up until it makes sense. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. It sounds like self-reliance, like you're taking responsibility for your own learning. But what I didn't understand was that I'd taken that idea a bit too far. I started to treat isolation, I guess, as part of the process. Like struggling through it on your own was somehow the right way to do it. And looking back now, that wasn't really what was being asked of me. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about learning properly. And learning properly, that doesn't happen in isolation. It happens around people who already hold that standard. People who have already made the mistakes. People who've seen what happens when things aren't done well. And who have adjusted over time to get it right more often than not. That was probably the first real shift for me. Realising that what I thought was discipline was actually just it was just a gap in understanding. Another one was how I saw success. Early on, I think I was more outcome focused than I realised. Not in an obvious way to me, but I wasn't out there chasing numbers or trying to tick boxes. But there was still this quiet pull, right, towards wanting something to happen. Now, I think that's natural, right? You're wanting that effort to lead somewhere, wanting the time to mean something tangible. And again, that sounds reasonable. You put the time in, you expect something back. But that expectation, even when it's subtle, it changes how you see situations. It changes how you interpret opportunities. It can even change how you justify decisions without you really noticing it happening. Well, I can see that more clearly now. Moments where I thought something felt right, but if I'm honest, part of that came from me wanting it to be right. Wanting it to line up, wanting it to be, I guess, close enough. And that's not something I was consciously doing. It wasn't a deliberate choice, it was just underneath it all. And I didn't have the awareness yet. Not to catch it properly. That's been one of the bigger corrections. Understanding that desire doesn't just sit there quietly. It moves. It shapes things. It presents itself as logic, when really it's just momentum. And if you're not paying attention to that, it's easy to drift into decisions that feel justified at the time, but don't quite hold up when you look back at them properly. There's also the way I thought about confidence. I used to think confidence in this space came from competence, from being able to, do the thing, make the shot, read the sign, move well enough to get into position. And those things matter. They absolutely do. But what I didn't see early on was that confidence in the people I respect in this space doesn't come from what they can do. It comes from what they're willing not to do. The restraint, the willingness to walk away, the ability to sit with a situation and say, not this one, even when everything in you wants it to be. That's not something you really understand until you've been in enough situations where that decision matters. And I hadn't been there yet. So I filled the gap with what made sense to me at the time. Which is what we all do, right? You build a picture based on what you've seen and what you think you know. And then, over time, that picture either holds up or it doesn't. For me, parts of it didn't. Not dramatically, I guess. Not in a way that blew everything apart. Just in small, steady corrections. Steady corrections where you realise that's not quite it. That's not what this is actually about. And you adjust. There's probably a few more of those still coming. But the biggest thing, looking back, isn't that I got things wrong. It's that I didn't realise where I was guessing. Where I was filling in the gaps without knowing it. Because once you see that clearly, it changes how you approach everything after it. You stop assuming you've got it all worked out. You start paying a bit more attention to where your understanding actually comes from. And you get a bit more comfortable sitting in a space where you don't fully know yet. Which, if I'm honest, is most of it. And that might sound like a small shift, but it's not. Because it doesn't just stay with you. And the reason I keep coming back to that is because it's not just a personal thing. It doesn't just sit with me. The way you understand this or misunderstand it doesn't stay contained. It shows up in how you move. It shows up in the decisions you make, or the ones that you don't, and the ones that you justify. And most of the time, those decisions don't look like much from the outside. They're small. A choice to take something or not. A decision about distance, about conditions, about whether something feels right or just close enough. No one's standing there keeping score. There's no audience in that moment. And that's exactly where it matters most. Because those small decisions, they're what everything else is built on. And if your understanding underneath them is even slightly off, even just a little bit, then over time, that shows up. Not all at once, not in some obvious catastrophic way. Just in the way that things drift. Your standards soften slightly. Your lines in the sand move a little. Good enough starts to feel acceptable. And you don't always notice it happening. That's the part that's easy to miss. It's not that people are out there deliberately doing the wrong thing. Most people aren't. It's that the line between right and almost right isn't always obvious until you've seen both clearly. And if you haven't seen it clearly yet, you're making decisions based on something that feels right, not something that's actually been tested. And I can see that now, in ways that I couldn't earlier. Moments where I thought I was making a solid call, but looking back, there was just enough uncertainty there that it probably should have gone the other way. Not because the outcome was bad, but because the standard wasn't as clear. Not as clear as I thought it was. And that's where it all connects to everything I've talked about in the last episode. That gap between what this actually is and how it's seen. Because the public version of hunting, it doesn't include any of this. It doesn't include the hesitation. It doesn't include the second guessing or the decisions that don't happen. It sees the outcome. And that's it. So when something is done poorly, even slightly, that's what carries. Not the thousands of decisions that were made properly. Not the restraint. Not the process. Just the visible result. And from the outside, there's no way to separate one from the other. That's just the reality of it. Which means the margin for error isn't really a margin at all. It's the whole thing. Because once it's out there, once it's seen, it becomes part of how this is understood by people who will never step into it themselves. And that's where it shifts from being personal to something a bit broader. Not in a representing the whole community sense. I'm not doing that. But in the sense that what I do and what I'm comfortable with sits inside something bigger than just me. Land access. Public perception. Trust. Those things aren't abstract or weird. They're shaped by behavior over time. And behavior is shaped by understanding. So if the understanding is off, well, the outcome will be too. Maybe not immediately and maybe not obviously, but eventually. And that's the part I didn't fully appreciate earlier on. I thought responsibility was mostly about doing the obvious things right. Safety, respect, following the rules. And those things absolutely matter. They're non-negotiable. But what sits underneath that, well, that's where the real weight is. the judgement, the awareness of where your decision is actually coming from, whether it's grounded or whether it's being pulled slightly by something else. That's harder to see. And it's easy to get wrong too, because no one else can check it for you in the moment. There's no external correction. It's just you. It's just you and whatever standard you're holding. And if that standard isn't fully formed yet, you're going to get some of that wrong. And that's just a part of it. But what matters is whether you recognize it when you do. Whether you adjust. Whether you tighten things up instead of letting them slide. Because it's very easy to go the other way. It's very easy to justify it or to tell yourself it was fine. To move on without really looking at it properly. And that's where things start to drift. Not in big, obvious steps, just gradually. Until you're operating slightly outside the line, without ever having made a conscious decision to cross it. That's the part I'm more aware of now. Not in a perfect sense. Not like I've eliminated it. Just enough to know that it's there. And that it needs to be watched. And that I need to be accountable for it internally. Because once you've seen how easy it is to be slightly off, you don't really get to ignore that anymore. So, at some point, it stops being about understanding it, and it starts being about how you actually hold it. So, where that leaves me now is with a standard that's a bit clearer than it was before. Not in a rigid sense, not like I've got everything mapped out and locked in. More just a line that I'm aware of. A line that I know I'm responsible for holding, regardless of what's happening around me. And most of that comes back to restraint. Not as a concept, just in what I actually do. What I'm willing to take. What I'm willing to pass on. What I'm comfortable with and what I'm not. Because the more time I spend in this, the more obvious it becomes that the defining moments, they aren't the ones where something happens. If I'm being honest, they're the ones where it doesn't. The situations where everything looks close enough, but something just doesn't quite sit right. And you have to make a call. No one else is there. There's no one to check it against. No one to validate it. It's just you and whatever standard you're holding in that moment. That's where this really lives. So, for me, the line is pretty simple. If something isn't clear, I leave it. If I'm not certain, I leave it. If I'm having to convince myself it's okay, I leave it. Not because I have to, but because I've decided that's where the line sits. And that's been one of the biggest shifts. Moving from, can I do this, to, should I be doing this at all? They're not the same question. And early on, I probably leaned more on the first one. Now it's the second one that matters. The technical side of things, that's important. Being able to shoot properly, understanding distance, reading conditions, all of that matters. But it's not what defines the standard. Because you can be technically capable and still make poor decisions. That's the part that sits underneath everything else. And it's the part that no one sees. It's easy to look for an outcome and assume it was either good or bad based on what happened, right? But what sits behind that, the decision that led to it, that's where the real line is. And that's what I'm paying more attention to now. Where is that decision coming from? Is it clear? Is it grounded? Or is there something else pushing it? Impatience, expectation, wanting it to work out. Because those things, they don't disappear. They're always there in some form. You just get better at recognizing them and deciding whether they get a say in what happens next. That's the part I'm holding on to now. Not eliminating those things, just not letting them drive the decision. There's also a level of consistency that comes with that. Not doing one thing when it's quiet and another when something finally lines up. Not adjusting the standard based on how long it's been or how much effort's gone in. Because that's where it starts to slip. When the situation feels like it justifies a slightly different call. And maybe no one would ever know. Maybe the outcome would look fine from the outside. But that's not really the point. Because that's where it starts to slip. Where the situation feels like it justifies a slightly different call. And maybe no one would ever know. Maybe the outcome would look fine from the outside. But that's not really the point. The point is whether it holds up to the same standard, regardless of the situation. That's what I'm aiming for. Not perfection. I'm not pretending I get that right every time. But I'm aware of it now, in a way that I wasn't before. And that awareness changes how you move. Even outside of the actual hunt. How you talk about it. What you choose to share and what you leave out. Because once something becomes visible, once it's spoken about or shown, it carries its own weight. It becomes part of how this is understood by someone else. And I'm very conscious of that. Not in a way that makes me pull back from it, just in a way that, I guess, keeps it aligned. In my mind, the hunt comes first. The experience comes first. If something's shared after that, it needs to reflect what actually happened, not just the part that looks clean or decisive. And that means including the uncertainty, the missed chances, and the decisions that didn't happen. Otherwise, it just stops being honest. And once that line starts to blur, it's hard to pull it back. So the standard, it's not complicated. It's just consistent. Clear decisions, clear opportunities, no pressure to force an outcome. And if it doesn't line up, that's fine. Because the point isn't to make something happen. It's to make the right call. And most of the time, that call is to leave it alone. And I think that's the part that's taken me by surprise. Is how much of this hasn't stayed contained to hunting. I didn't really expect that. I thought it would sit in its own space. I thought it'd be something I do. Like something I learned, something that has its own set of rules and decisions attached to it. But it doesn't really work like that. Once you start seeing things a certain way, it doesn't just switch off when you leave the bush. It carries. Not in a dramatic sense, just in small, steady ways. Ways that are hard to ignore once you notice them. Like patience is probably the most obvious one. Not the kind where you're trying to be patient. Just a quieter tolerance for things not lining up straight away. Spending enough time in situations where effort doesn't guarantee any outcome, or or where you can do everything properly and still walk away with nothing. That changes how you see time a little bit. It takes the edge off the need for things to happen on your timeline. You stop pushing as hard for a resolution. Not because you've lowered the standard, just because you've accepted that it doesn't always work like that. And that's carried into everything else. Work, family, even small everyday things that used to feel more frustrating than they probably needed to be. There's a bit more space there now. And that's carried into everything else. Work, family, volunteering, even small everyday things that used to feel more frustrating than they probably needed to be. There's a bit more space there now. Attention has shifted as well. You start noticing things you wouldn't have picked up on before. Movement, sound, patterns. Not because you're trying to, just because you've spent enough time relying on those small details for things to make sense. And that doesn't switch off. Driving through the hills, walking through a paddock, or even just sitting somewhere quietly, there's a different level of awareness that sits underneath it all now. Not intense, just, present. Solitude's changed too. Spending long periods of time on your own, without noise, without distraction, without anything really happening. It stops feeling like something that needs to be filled. It just becomes normal. And eventually, it becomes something you value. Not as an escape, just as a quieter place to sit with things. That's probably been one of the more unexpected parts. There's also been a shift in how I see food. Not in a heavy, overthought way, just in a sense that it's no longer abstract, right? And when you've been part of the process, even just a few times, it completely changes how you relate to it. It's not just something you pick up anymore. It's something that required something else to stop. That awareness doesn't go away, even when you're not the one directly involved. You notice it. And with that comes a bit more care. Not wasting it. Not treating it like it's interchangeable. Just recognizing what it actually is. That's been a quiet change, but a constant one. There's also a shift in how I see outcomes. Success, and what that actually means. Earlier on, I probably tied that a bit too closely to whether something happened. Whether the effort led to something tangible. Now, it's different. It's more about whether the decisions held up. Whether the standard was there when it needed to be. Because you can walk away with nothing and still feel like it was right. And you can have something happen and you know it wasn't as solid as it should have been. That's a strange adjustment at first. Honestly, it is. But once it clicks, it doesn't really go back. And that carries into everything else. You stop measuring things purely by outcome. You start looking a bit closer at how they got there. There's also a level of humility that comes with it. Not the kind you talk about. Although I'm aware how absurd that sounds, given this is a podcast I've created about me learning how to hunt and talking about it. But just the quiet awareness that you're not as dialed in as you might have thought you were. That there's always something you're missing. Always something you haven't seen yet. And that the moment you think you've got it fully worked out is probably the moment you've stopped paying attention properly. Now, that's been reinforced enough times that it sticks. And it's changed how I approach things, outside of hunting as well. Less certainty, more awareness of what that certainty is actually coming from, and whether it's earned or just assumed. I've also become more aware of how easy it is to form a strong opinion, especially about something you haven't experienced directly. Not just in hunting, in anything. Once you've been on the inside of something that looks completely different from the outside, and it's hard to ignore that pattern elsewhere, you start catching yourself. Or at least noticing where you're filling in gaps without any real understanding. And that doesn't mean you stop having opinions. It just means you hold them, I guess, a little bit more loosely. There's less urgency to be right. More willingness to just sit with not fully knowing. And that's probably the biggest shift. Not confidence and not clarity. Just a bit more comfort in the uncertainty. A bit more awareness of where you stand and where you don't. And a bit more care in how you move because of that. None of that makes you special. Plenty of things will do that to you, all right, if you stick with them long enough. This just happens to be one that's done it for me. And it's still doing it, which is probably the point. It doesn't really stop. And I think that's probably where this all comes back to. Why keep talking about it at all? Because there's a version of this where I don't. Where hunting stays exactly where it's always been. Certainly for most people who do it. Private. Quiet. Something you experience and carry with you without feeling the need to explain it to anyone outside of that. And I understand that. There's a part of me that still leans that way. Honestly, there is. It's simpler. There's no expectation. There's no need to find the right words for something that doesn't always fit neatly into them. There's no risk of getting it slightly wrong in a way that sits out there longer than it should. Just the experience and whatever that means to you. But that's not where this has ended up. And I think part of the reason for that is remembering what it felt like before I stepped into it properly. How strange it all was to me. How easy it was to form an opinion without ever really being close enough to understand it. Not because I was trying to, just because there wasn't much else to go on. And most of what was out there, well, it didn't feel quite right. It either pushed too hard in one direction or avoided the reality of it altogether. There wasn't really much in the middle. Not much that sounded like someone just trying to explain what it actually felt like without needing it to land in a certain way. That's what this has been for me. Not a defense, not a way of convincing anyone. Just a record. A record of what it looks like from the inside, while I'm still figuring it out. And that part hasn't changed. If anything, it's become more important. Because the more I understand about this, the more I realise how easy it would be to, I guess, present it in a way that looks clean, looks certain and resolved. And it's not. It doesn't feel like that when you're in it. It feels uncertain. It feels conditional. It feels like something you're constantly adjusting to, rather than something you've fully worked out. And I think that's worth showing. Not perfectly, not completely, just honestly. Because I know how easy it is to mistake confidence for understanding. I've done that myself. So if this does anything, I'd rather it sit somewhere closer to reality than to certainty. Closer to process than outcome. Closer to someone working it out than someone explaining it. And that means it's not always going to be clean, or consistent, or complete. But that's probably the point. This isn't something you arrive at. It's something you stay in. And the more time you spend there, the more you realize that the standard doesn't really come from what you say. It comes from what you do when it matters. When no one's watching. When there's no reason to explain it. When the only thing guiding the decision is whatever you've chosen to hold yourself to. That's the part that stays. Everything else shifts. And that's where this sits for me now. Not at the end of anything. Not at the beginning either. Just somewhere in the middle of it all. Still learning. Still adjusting. Still getting things wrong. And trying to recognize it when I do. And that's enough. For now. I'm Ben McGorm. This is The Wild Harvest.